welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith. In our series, we will show you how to play a game, and then over the course of the following episodes, we'll actually play that game, and where possible, put a seat at the table just for you to play along with us. You'll be able to watch, and between episodes, vote on what you think should happen next. Now, what we hope is that over the course of the series, you will learn whether or not a game would be a good fit for you, your family, or your gaming group. Now, in this series, we're going to be covering the game Space Hulk 3rd Edition, released in 2009 by Games Workshop. In this game, one player is controlling the Space Marines. Think of them as heavily armored warriors that are aboard a Space Hulk, which is kind of like an empty floating vessel in space. However, on board this vessel are the Gene Stealers. These are scary alien creatures controlled by the other player. Now, currently this game is out of print, and normally we would not cover a game that's maybe harder for you to find. That said, this game got the most votes in a recent poll we had with our viewers, and it has been featured in pretty much every opening credit sequence that we've run since this series started. So it has a special place in our hearts. We're making this one exception this one time, and I do hope you enjoy it.
Captain Dallas, this is Command. Be advised, we have several contacts approaching your position. Command, this is Captain Dallas. We have no contact. We have no contact. Over. Wait a minute. What's that?
I might get asked about this, so let me answer right up front. That song you just heard was created by the fantastically talented Chaz Charlton, who continues to provide our series with great music and sound effects. So if you're interested in hearing that song, outside of having to watch our series, I'm hoping he might be able to upload that to his SoundCloud account. If he does, I will post a link to that in the description to this video as soon as possible. If you're working on a project, though, and you need some audio work done, I would really encourage you to check out Chaz. I'll put a link to his website here on screen. As well, you'll find it at the end of this video in the credits. He is a super guy to deal with. He's been great to us. I know he'll be great for you, so definitely check him out. But you've now seen enough of me. I'm going to get the camera down the table. We'll start talking about Space Hulk and how it's played. Space Hulk takes place on several thick and textured tiles like these that you set up based on the configuration provided by one of the several scenarios that comes with the game. Each player has an objective, and the game is played until one of the players fulfills their objective, making them the winner. The characters that the players control come as highly detailed models that can be painted. In fact, one of our viewers, Cole Fisher, painted these two models here and sent them to us. Now, I had also painted a model, this one here, which happens to be one of the same ones that Cole painted. But the rest of my models are still in their currently unpainted state, like so. Also, the game comes with several door pieces like the ones that you see here, as well as dice, a variety of tokens, and several other items that we'll discuss as they are required. Space Hulk is played over several turns that are broken into phases for each of the players. The Space Marine player gets to go first, and they start by completing the command phase, which is an opportunity for the Space Marine player to earn additional bonus actions for their models later in the game. First, you take these command point tokens numbered from 1 to 6. You'll want to flip them over so you don't know which ones are which, give them a quick shuffle, and then randomly draw one of the tokens. As the Space Marine player, you get to look at the value on the token, but don't show the Gene Stealer player. Then you take the token and place it face down on the 0 position here on this board, which is known as the Mission Status Display. To understand the value of this token, you probably first need to understand that over the course of the game, you will be able to activate your models, and each model will be able to take a fixed number of actions. However, these bonus actions on this token can be used at any time, including during the Gene Stealer's turn, to give additional actions to your Space Marine models. Each time you choose to use one of these bonus actions, you announce that you're using one, and then the Genestealer player moves the token along the track, showing how many actions you have used up so far. You are not allowed to use more bonus actions than are written on the token. If you do, you automatically lose the game. Thankfully, you are able to check this token at any time to remind yourself. Just be careful that the Genestealer doesn't see it. You don't want that player to know how many bonus actions you might be able to take. Now, you may have a sergeant model in your squad, like this one here. As long as you have at least one sergeant active in the game, then when you go to draw your command token, you can choose, for instance, if you draw a lousy 1, like I did, you can return it to the pool, give it another shuffle, and then draw a new token. Hopefully not a 1 again. However, if you do draw and you don't like what you got with your second draw, that's too bad. You're going to have to stick with it. Also, once the token is placed on the mission status display, this is when the Genestealer player takes the timer that's included with the game and starts it. This is how long the Space Marine player will have to take all of their actions with all of their models. The Genestealer player does not have this limitation during their turn. So thematically, this represents the Space Marine player being under constant threat and attack and having to act quickly and sometimes without enough time to properly prepare their strategies. It's also a good way to keep the game moving if you have a slow Space Marine player. After the command phase, it is now the Space Marine player's action phase. In this phase, the player activates and may take up to 4 actions with each of their models. The models must be activated one at a time, and even if you don't use up all 4 actions for a model, you cannot go back to it later in the phase once you start activating a new model. The only exception to this are those command points that we mentioned earlier. Those can be used at any time during this phase to give bonus actions to any model, including models that you already activated. And any number of additional actions can be given to a model as long as you don't exceed the amount of bonus actions that were shown on the token. So, in this case here, if I had 3 bonus actions that I could use, I could give 1 to each of the 3 models, or I could give 3 bonus actions to a single model. Alternatively, you might save some or all of your command points to use during the Genestealer's turn, but we'll talk about that later. So as I said, when you activate a Space Marine model, you can take up to 4 actions with it. There are a variety of different actions, so let's go over those now, keeping in mind that although I will be explaining the different actions for both Space Marines and Genestealer models, during the Space Marine action phase, only the Space Marine can activate their models. The Genestealer models will activate later. One of the actions you can take is moving forward, and that costs 1 point per move. But what direction is forward? Well, it's important to understand that each of your models has a facing. Wherever their head is pointed on the model, that is the direction they are facing. But keep in mind, a model can never face diagonally like that. Both Space Marines and Genestealer models can move straight ahead forward or diagonally forward. So in this case, if I wanted to, for 1 action point, I could move diagonally forward like that. The facing doesn't change. Space Marine and Genestealer models can also move backwards, but it costs 2 action points to do so. And again, they can move backwards directly or diagonally, like so. A Genestealer model can spend 1 action point to move sideways, but a Space Marine model cannot. At all. However, for 1 action point, a Space Marine or a Genestealer can turn 90 degrees, like so. So if a Space Marine model was standing here and facing like this, but wanted to move into this square, they would first have to spend 1 action point to turn, and then another action point to move forward. The Genestealer, being more agile, can simply spend 1 action point and move sideways. Also, as an added bonus, Genestealer models can turn 90 degrees for free anytime they make a move action. So for example, if I wanted to move diagonally forward like this, but then turn to my left, I could do that as 1 action point. And if that wasn't enough, a Genestealer model can also turn a full 180 degrees for 1 action point as well. There are some things that all models can't do. All models can't move diagonally between walls and other models. So for example, normally, for one action point, this Space Marine could move forward diagonally into this square here. However, if there's another model positioned here, like so, then there's not enough room for this large Space Marine to squeeze through this wall and this model. So the Marine would not be able to move to that location. Also, models cannot move freely through doors. First, they would have to open the door, and that costs one action point, and the door has to be adjacent to the model in one of its 3 front squares. So this Space Marine could open the door from here, or from here, or from here. And when you open a door, you just slide the door off to the side like so. Well, that's all well and good, but these models have all kinds of crazy weapons on them, so let's talk about shooting actions. Common weapons like the Storm Bolter here, or more unique weapons like the Assault Cannon, shown here, cost 1 action point to fire, whereas a Heavy Flamer, like this weapon here, costs a total of 2 action points to fire. When shooting your weapon, you are typically targeting an enemy model, but you can also target doors as well. Now, different weapons have slightly different rules, but there are some common things that we have to deal with no matter what the weapon. The first is line of sight. A Space Marine has to be able to see what it wants to shoot at, and thankfully they can see an unlimited distance as long as there are no doors or walls in the way. Which means, of course, a closed door here would block line of sight to this Genestealer alien. Another thing to remember is that their vision stretches out like a cone in front of them. So a Space Marine in this position can see these 3 spaces, and then on a larger tile, 5 spaces, and then 7 spaces, and so on, expanding out. Most of the tiles in this game, however, are small like this one, or narrow like these hallways, so you never really take advantage of that expanding cone view. Corners also affect line of sight. For example, this Space Marine here can see directly down this hallway, but it cannot see around the corner, so it can't see this Genestealer in order to attack it. In order to be able to see this Genestealer, the Space Marine would first have to move to at least this space, because the model can see the 3 squares directly in front of it, which would be this square, and, well, if there was a square here, it could see here as well. If the Genestealer model was a little farther down the hall like so, the Space Marine would not be able to see it. So in order to see it, for example, it could move 1 space forward and then turn. Now the Genestealer is within the model's line of sight. After line of sight, you also have to consider the range of the weapon. A few of them have a limited range, in which case you would have to count the squares from you to the target. This particular Genestealer is 3 squares away. Once that is done, the actual attack itself is very straightforward. When you attack with a Storm Bolter weapon, like this one here, you roll 2 6-sided dice, and if you roll a 6 on either die, which I did not do, then you've killed the target, and you would get to remove the model from the board. I'm going to cover the rules for the different weapons in the next video when we discuss the scenario and setup. Now remember what I said. Turning costs an action point, and shooting costs an action point. But Space Marine models have a bonus. Anytime they turn or move, they can shoot a Storm Bolter if they have one, or the Assault Cannon if they have one, for free. So this model could turn and then shoot its Storm Bolter at this enemy. And there, I actually rolled a hit. Hooray! So this enemy would be removed. If I hadn't hit the enemy and I moved forward, I could then take another free shot. So I'm only paying the action point to move. The shot is free. Of course, you still have to check for line of sight and make sure that your target is within range. Models equipped with a Storm Bolter or Assault Cannon can go on Overwatch. This action costs 2 action points and lasts until the end of the turn, which means it extends into the Genestealer's phases. Thematically, this means the Space Marine is putting all of his attention on readying his weapons to fire at the slightest sign of enemy movement during the enemy's turn. To signify this, we put an Overwatch marker beside the model. Now here's what's so great about this. A model on Overwatch that has line of sight to any action by a Genestealer model within 12 spaces must take a free shoot action against that model. So for example, each time a model is advancing towards, say, this Space Marine here, the Space Marine can now take a free shoot action. Model moves again, another free shoot action, and so on. Possibly, if you roll a 6, even killing that model. The only time you can't do this is if a model takes an action that takes it out of the line of sight. So for example, if this Genestealer for its action moved backwards diagonally like this, it's no longer within the line of sight of this model. So the Space Marine could not take a free shoot action. I'm getting worried here. I'm going to use up all my rolling 6 luck in this example instead of during the game. Okay, so one weapon-specific issue I'll mention here is that when you're firing a Stormbolter, like this Space Marine has, and you're on Overwatch, there is a chance that in the frenzy of reacting to enemy movement, the weapon might jam. So if, when rolling the 2 dice, you get 2 numbers that are the same, so let's say I rolled 2 4s, that means the weapon has jammed. It could be 2 3s, 2 2s, 2 1s, doesn't matter what it is, 2 6s, the weapon is jammed. We would flip this token over to show that the weapon is jammed. Now the Space Marine will not be able to fire again until he spends an action point to clear the jam. And since this jam will happen during the Genestealer's phase, the only actions the model will have to spend are from that special command pool of action points. So hopefully one of them was saved. Now remember, a jam can only happen when firing the Stormbolter while on Overwatch. Lastly, if the Overwatch model is attacked in a close assault, which we'll talk about later, or takes any other action besides clearing a jam, the Overwatch status ends. Now, a close assault is an action taken when you are directly facing an adjacent enemy model. So both of these models are directly facing one another, so either of them could take a close assault action. The most common close assault weapon for Space Marines are Power Fists, like this one here. And Genestealers, well, there are many, many claws. Genestealers don't have ranged weapons, so they will only be able to perform close assault actions. As you're about to see, Space Marines want to avoid close assaults at all costs. A close assault action costs 1 action point. And in a close assault action, regardless of who is attacking, whether it's the Genestealer player or the Space Marine player, the Genestealer player always rolls 3 dice, and the Space Marine only rolls 1. So let's just roll an example for the Genestealers, and then we'll roll one for the Space Marines. The winner is the player with the highest value on a single die. So you can see here, even though the Genestealer rolled 1 die that was lower and 1 that was a tie, it rolled this 5, which is higher. That means the Genestealer won. And with 1 successful hit like that, the model is removed. So very easily you can see how these Space Marine models can be taken off the board. And you generally don't have a lot of them. In the case of a tie, so let's just say that the Space Marine player had also rolled a 5, then no one wins. But really you can see the Space Marines are severely overmatched in close assaults. That said, if the Space Marine model being attacked is a Sergeant, and it's being attacked in the front, like this Sergeant here, the Sergeant gets to add +1 to the result of rolling his dice. So as I said, if the attacker wins the roll, then the defender is destroyed and removed from play. If the defender gets lucky and wins the die roll and is facing the attacker, then the attacker is removed. However, let's say the Genestealer was attacking the Space Marine, and the Space Marine was back to the Genestealer model, or even just sideways to, like so. If the defender, in this case the Space Marine, manages to tie or win in the roll, instead of destroying the model, you then have the option to turn and directly face the model. This way, if in the second close assault attack the Space Marine model wins, it will be able to remove the Genestealer model from play, because now the model is facing its enemy head on and using that Power Fist to smash back. As with shoot actions, you can also target doors with a close assault. Keep in mind, of course, the door won't be fighting back, so it won't get to roll any dice. And in order to destroy a door in this way, you need to roll at least 1 6. Now you may be wondering, why bother destroying a door when you can just open it? But one of the primary reasons is to prevent the Genestealer from closing the door again, blocking your line of sight, while he amasses a huge army of Genestealers behind it. If the door is destroyed, Genestealer can't block that line of sight. It's going to be much harder to build up an army in there. And in case you're wondering, that's about half of the Genestealer models that come with the set. And lastly, a Space Marine model can take the guard action. This costs 2 action points and is quite similar to the Overwatch action, except this time the Space Marine is preparing himself for close assault. To show this, we place a guard token beside the model. Now keep in mind, you can only be on either Overwatch or guard, but not both. And while on guard, the Space Marine, after rolling its die during close combat and seeing the result of the Genestealer, may re-roll his die. But he must keep the second result. A Space Marine model on guard stays on guard until the end of the turn. So after the Space Marine player has activated all of his or her models, the Genestealer phases start, beginning with the reinforcement phase. Now, we should go back for a second. At the start of any game, these tokens, known as blips, and they're labeled 1 through 3, are all flipped over, shuffled, and then placed face down. And the scenario will tell the Genestealer player how many of these blips they start with. So maybe they'd start with 2 of the blips. And then the scenario will also say during each reinforcement phase how many more blips they'll be able to draw. So maybe it'll be 2 blips every turn. Once drawn, the Genestealer player may look at the bottom of the blips, but keeps the numbers on the blips a secret from the other player. Blips that the Genestealer player receives are placed beside one of these purple arrows representing a Genestealer entry point. The numbers on the bottom of the blips represent how many Genestealer models the blip will turn into once it is revealed. So thematically, these tokens represent the little blips that are appearing on the Space Marine's radar. So the Space Marine player will be able to see these blips as they move around, but won't know exactly how many Genestealer models they represent until later in the game. As I said though, at first we place these blips off the board like we see here, and once they have been placed, we move on to the Genestealer action phase. This is where we go through the same process as we did for the Space Marine action phase, but now it is the Genestealer's turn to activate all of their models and blips. One big difference, however, is the Genestealer models and blips get 6 action points each, whereas the Space Marine only had 4 each. The Genestealer actions we covered earlier, so let me just explain the actions you can take when activating blips. First of all, blips don't have a facing, so when they move, they can move in any direction at all for 1 action point per square. They can also open and close doors for 1 action point as well. And actually, that's all the actions they can do as blips. As mentioned though, they start off the board like these ones here. So you spend 1 action point to move them from lurking and then onto the first space of the board. That said, when you activate a blip, just like any model, you don't have to do anything with it. You can use 0 of the actions available to them. So a blip that is off the board, like this one here, can stay there for as long as you want. And you can have up to 3 blips at each entry point lurking in this way. And actually, if a Space Marine is 6 or fewer squares away from a Genestealer entry point during a Genestealer's action phase, then any blips placed there that turn must lurk for the rest of the turn, meaning they can't enter the board. However, on the following turn, even if the Space Marine is still there, they could potentially enter. Now, one thing to note about blip movement is that a blip can never move into a Space Marine's line of sight. So a blip can't move like that, because this blip is now within this Space Marine's line of sight. If a blip does this accidentally and it's caught, well then the blip must move back to where it was last out of sight, and it loses its remaining actions. A blip also can't move next to a Space Marine, even if they are out of that Space Marine's line of sight. So in this case, the closest the blip could get would be right there. So blips are fine for moving around the board, but how do we turn them from blips into scary aliens? Well, there's 2 ways. The first is voluntary conversion. On the Genestealer's action phase, if a blip has not yet been activated, including blips that are by an entry point, then the Genestealer can reveal the blip by flipping it over and then placing it off of the board. Then that number of Genestealer models can be placed where the blip had been. So the first model has to be placed where the blip was. And then the remaining models, in this case we turned over a 3, so there would still be 2 more models, they have to be placed adjacent to where the blip had been. So we'll put 1 model here and then 1 model behind, like so. Sometimes there won't be an empty space for the extra models, in which case they are lost and can't enter play. Also, models placed during a voluntary reveal can't be placed in the line of sight of a Space Marine model. So that's another way in which extra models may not be able to come into play. For example, if this door was open and the blip had actually been here, the blip is still out of the line of sight of the Space Marine that's sitting here, so this blip could be revealed. It shows as 3, so the first model would go here. A model could go here, but no model could be placed here because this model would be within the line of sight of that Space Marine. So this model would be lost. Another way models can be revealed is involuntarily. This happens anytime during a turn where a Space Marine can draw line of sight to a blip. So for example, if this Space Marine here opened the door, suddenly it has forced line of sight upon this blip. In that case, again, the blip is automatically flipped over. We see it's a 3, that means 3 models are going to be entering. But because it was an involuntary reveal, now the Space Marine player gets to decide the placement of the models following the placement rules. So one of the models must be placed in that location, then the other 2 have to be placed adjacent. So the Space Marine player could choose to put them here and here, or possibly one over here or one over here. Now here's a little trick. Let's say the door was closed and this blip was actually right beside the door. Now on the Genestealer turn, the Genestealer could open the door. Remember, blips are not allowed to move into the line of sight of a Space Marine model. But this one didn't move in front of it, it just opened a door. So in that case, it's considered an involuntary reveal, and now the blip is flipped over. And again, the Space Marine player gets to decide how these models are going to be placed. Perhaps like that. Also, if a blip has not been activated on the turn in which it was revealed, any of the Genestealer models placed are then free to activate as normal during their turn. And keep in mind, the number of Genestealer models in the game is the limit to how many can be on the board at any one time. But as I think I might have mentioned, there is a lot of them. Now, one thing I should bring up here is that any remaining command points that a Space Marine player carried over into the Genestealer's turn can be spent during the Genestealer phase. Each time a Space Marine model has line of sight to an action made by a Genestealer model, one action can be taken by any Space Marine model, even if that model was not the one to witness the Genestealer action. So let's say we had one action point left here on our command point token, and we saw this Genestealer move one space closer. Notice this model has line of sight to the Genestealer. Now, this model is not as much of a threat here because this model is quite far away. So instead, the Space Marine player may choose to spend one action point to allow this Space Marine to attack this Genestealer. So the very last phase of the game is called the mission status phase. And very simply, each player checks the win conditions of the scenario to see if either player has won. And then the Space Marine player reveals the command point counter token to show that he or she did not spend more command points than allowed, and returns it to the pool of command point tokens. Unspent actions are wasted. Then the players remove any markers for Overwatch, jams, and the guard conditions. And then you're ready to start a new turn. Okay, whew, that was a lot of rules, but hopefully it was clear for you to follow. In the next episode, we're going to come back. I'm going to have the whole scenario set up here, be able to show you what the conditions are for winning the scenario. I'm also going to go over the different Space Marine models and the rules for their weapons. Won't take very long at all, so I do hope you join us for that. Also, I'm going to go over how you can enter and potentially win in our contest. We're giving away, no, not Space Hulk, but a Space Hulk card game that was donated to us by Cole Fisher, the same person who kindly donated these greatly painted miniatures that we're going to be using. Thanks again for sticking through our rules explanation video. I know it's a lot to absorb. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to write them to me in the YouTube comments below, or you can go to our Facebook page or on Twitter, post your questions there. I'll do my best to respond to every question as quickly as I possibly can. So I do hope you'll join us in the next episode, but until then, thanks for watching.